So, hello everyone. Welcome again to episode 3 of season 3 of our online seminar series, the International Perspectives on Corpus Technology for Language Learning, co-organized by myself here at the University of Queensland in Australia and our partners from the State University of Sao Paulo in Brazil. Today we have Dr. Maggie Charles from Oxford University, who's going to be presenting on student autonomy and data-driven learning in English for academic purposes. Dr. Charles is kind of, like I mentioned to her before, I'm kind of a big fan of her work. She's one of the people who originally got me into the use of Corpora for language learning, in particular the compilation of DIY Corpora or do-it-yourself Corpora, where instead of relying on these big kind of collections like the British National Corpus or COCA or some of these well-known general corpora, it's really unlocking the potential for smaller, very specific, and very contextualized corpora for consultation by very specific, maybe disciplinary groups, sets of learners, different ages and abilities. So it served as a big inspiration for me in a lot of my earlier work and the work that I'm still involved with today. So it's really great to have Maggie on board. Before we begin, I'm just going to give a brief acknowledgement of country, which for those of you who've been coming week by week over the seasons, you'll know that this is something that we do within Australian universities. Whenever we have a public engagement like this, we just like to acknowledge the traditional owners and their custodianship of the lands or the virtual lands here today on which we meet, paying our respects to their ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country, while recognizing their valuable contributions to Australian and global society. So that was our acknowledgement of country, and today just going to now introduce Dr. Charles, who, as I mentioned, is one of the pioneers of using Corpora for data-driven learning for a number of years. She has taught EAP at Oxford University for many years and works on the CARA EAP program for exiled Syrian academics, which is a very noble cause. Her main research interests are in the analysis of academic discourse and the use of Corpora in EAP writing pedagogy, publishing widely in these areas in some of the top journals in the field. She also has books including Corpora ESP EAP Writing Instruction, co-edited with Anna Frankenberg-Garcia, who we have also had on our series in previous seasons, and the textbook Introducing English for Academic Purposes, co-written with Diane Pecorari with Routledge. So without any further ado, Maggie, if you'd like to take over the screen sharing, and we'll take it from here.
Hello. Oh, excuse me. Hello, everybody. I would just like to begin by thanking Peter very much indeed for that very fulsome introduction, and also for inviting me. I'm indeed pleased and very honored to be able to talk to you today. As Peter said, you can probably hear that my voice is not very strong, so I do apologize in advance for drinking water from time to time and perhaps sounding a little bit croaky. Okay, so what I want to talk about today is student autonomy and data-driven learning. And I think one of my reasons for thinking about this really is that I think it has been somewhat neglected, and indeed, despite the fact that it was perhaps at the basis of DDL in its early days, it seems to have sort of moved out of the spotlight slightly. Okay, so okay. Oh, I'm having problems moving my slide on. No. Okay.
It may just be the screen sharing.
Yeah. Wait a minute. I'm not sure quite.
Maybe if you unshare it and try sharing it again, you might solve the problem.
Yeah. Okay, wait a minute. Let's try. Oh dear. I've had this problem before actually. So but I've never really. Oh, there it goes. Can you still see it?
No.
Right. Okay. Let's yeah, I may have to use this in
Okay.
right. Okay. Yeah, I think that's working now. I'll leave it on this. Okay, so my talk then today is in 4 parts. First of all, I want to draw some connections between student autonomy and data-driven learning. And then I want to look more specifically at student autonomy in the DDL classroom. And then I'm going to introduce a study of mine that is related to student DDL use outside the classroom. And then finally, I'll just wrap up with some suggestions for future directions. Okay, so student autonomy and DDL. As I said at the beginning, there does seem to be a connection between these two right from the beginning of DDL. But let's look at the autonomy side first. And we probably should go back to Oleg in 1979. And he is generally regarded as the person who really first brought autonomy and foreign language learning together and brought them to the fore. And he defines the learning of language, in the learning of languages, autonomy is the ability to take charge of one's own learning. And this does seem to be something that has become, if you like, foundational in terms of defining autonomy and foreign language learning. But I'd like to unpack that just, oh, I'm not going to get any automation, am I? I'd like to unpack that just a little bit. And in terms of writers who have been examining autonomy for a long time, but actually looking at some of their most recent pronouncements. And David Little says, for me, language learner autonomy denotes a teaching and learning dynamic. And I think that's an interesting word. So it's this ongoing relationship. Autonomy is not a steady state, he says also elsewhere, in which learners plan, implement, monitor, and evaluate their own learning. So what this shows you is that the idea of language learning autonomy is actually relevant across the whole spectrum of elements of language learning. Benson, another very well-known proponent of language learner autonomy, said, autonomy is manifested in the form of autonomous language learning, which here refers to learning practices involving learners' control over aspects of their learning. So what he's particularly interested in there is control and the control that the learner exercises. And he talks about that in terms of control over learning management, control over the processes, and control over content. He also points out that it's learning that takes place outside the context of formal instruction. Now, I think I'm going to, okay, on the one hand, the study I'm going to introduce does take place outside the context of formal instruction. On the other, in fact, we can look at, and in the next part, I will be looking at the way in which autonomy can be incorporated actually also within classroom instruction. Okay, so data-driven learning, what does that have to do with autonomy? Well, I think, and we're all very familiar with Johns's statement that the language learner is a research worker whose learning needs to be driven by the access to the linguistic data, and this first statement really of data-driven learning. So we all know that, but when we look into John's work in a little bit more detail, where can we find evidence for autonomy, for his concern with autonomy? And I would say that it runs like a thread through his work. So we find statements like, we need to provide adequate opportunities for students to raise problems and queries. So in other words, students are involved in the setting of in the setting out of what they're going to do, their queries, their problems, and so on. He also says inductive strategies developed in the classroom should be equally applicable outside the classroom. So again, he's actually making this link between the classroom and outside the classroom. And finally, I think, and almost most explicitly, our aim is to help our students to survive and learn by themselves. Okay, and that seems to me to be very definitely the essence of autonomy. So students need to be able to be manage their own learning. So although he doesn't seem to, or at least I haven't found, although he doesn't seem to mention autonomy specifically, I think it lies at the very roots of data-driven learning. Another very early proponent I'd like to mention here is Aston. And that's because if you look at the titles of two of Aston's early papers, you can see that he is actually very much involved in incorporating learner input into parts of the learning where you might not expect it to be. Okay, so basically developing learning methods, involving learners in developing learning methods, and the learner as corpus designer. Okay, so you might not expect learners to have any input into those elements of learning, but in fact, Aston was thinking in those terms in the very early days of DDL. And at the bottom, then you can see this really great quote. Aston says, "The greatest attraction of Corpora for language pedagogy is their potential for autonomous learning." So we can ask then, to what extent has this potential been realized? And in a sense, that's really what I'm going to be asking throughout the talk today. Okay, so we can see DDL as existing on a cline of autonomy. Okay, and the idea of DDL on a cline, of course, between soft and hard DDL goes back to Gabriel Artus and also Mukherjee. So what, we can see these soft and hard poles, if you like, as being at opposite ends of this autonomy spectrum. So in terms of soft DDL, we've got teacher-led control tasks. It tends to be more deductive. It tends to have more teacher mediation. Okay, and an example of this would be Vincent's 2013 paper, where he shows some very interesting teacher-constructed concordance tasks. At the opposite end of the spectrum, then we have researchers like Bernardini and her very well-known paper on discovery learning, in which you've got an approach which is very learner-centered, and students were allowed and indeed encouraged to go corpus browsing. And this then is likely to be more inductive and to have much less teacher mediation. So you've got these two sort of poles. In the middle, and perhaps where really a lot, if not most, of DDL instruction is carried out, is somewhere in the middle, where you've got a sort of guided induction. And this was put forward by Johansson, who wanted to combine inductive and deductive elements to, if you like, to assist students on their DDL journey. Okay, so how about, if we've looked at DDL, so let's have a quick look at autonomy research. And there's a very good bibliography. This is curated by Reinders. I looked at it just a short few days ago. So I was looking at the latest version in 2022, and there are well over, going on for 3,000 references. If you search on data-driven learning, you find one hit, okay? This was to me extremely surprising, because I had expected data-driven learning to be much better represented. This is an interesting paper by Geloso and Yamaguchi. For what we're concerned with today, they focus on EFL spoken fluency, not EAP. And if you look at Corpus and Corpora, you get 5 hits. 2 of these are Kennedy and Micheli, whose target language is Italian, so these are not EAP. One is St. John, who's also looking at beginner EFL, so again, not EAP. And there are really only 2 that I could categorize as EAP. So, and one of these is already the Aston paper I've mentioned, and another is by Fan and Shu, EAP and it's dealing with legal English. So this is really, this was actually very surprising to me. And I think it's also a little bit disappointing. Now, as far as I can see, researchers basically input their own work into Reinders, or they share it with Reinders and he inputs it into the autonomy bibliography. So that suggests to me that really there is very little connection, at least now, with autonomy research. So out of 2,700 references, we've only got 6 related to DDL, and that's the highest we can come up with. And over those, only 2 are related to EAP. Now, since since DDL really arose in relation to EAP, and since EAP is still, I think, extremely strong in DDL, that is, well, it's really surprising. But we also notice that most references are to early work, and there's only 1 reference in the last 10 years, and that's the Geloso one. So what does it mean? Well, it's hard to say, really. Is it that DDL EAP research isn't relevant to autonomy research and vice versa? Okay, is it just perceived as just not relevant? Is it simply that DDL EAP research doesn't engage with the autonomy and vice versa? Or is it something else entirely? Is it just simply not the focus of current attention? Or is it perhaps too difficult to do? In other words, I think this raises questions about at least the relationship between DDL in the EAP world, for sure, but probably DDL more widely, and autonomy. So let's flesh this out just a little. Here are three quotes from recent studies. These are from the Journal for English for Academic Purposes. And it's, I think that there are a number of things that one can say about this. Now, Boulton and Vietkina point out that, that autonomy is not a focus of research attention. And I think you can see this coming through here. So, but also in various slightly different ways. So Shen, Carter, and Zhang say, corpus-based approach, fostering students' autonomy. And this seems to me to be it's taken for granted. We're not looking at this because this is obvious. Everybody knows this. So that's at one end of the spectrum, that it basically does not have to be researched. Bell says at this point, now he seems to be slightly more slightly more cautious, okay? So he says working at things out for themselves remains a dominant methodological hallmark of the EAP classroom. And he repeats that later. I'll show you another quote. But then he says a particular manifestation of this can arguably be found in the practical applications of data-driven learning. So he is by no means fully behind data-driven learning. Finally, Dolgova and Müller seem to me to be going one step further in a reluctance and perhaps a cautious rejection. And they say, increasing one's reliance on teacher-created corpus-informed materials may provide greater benefits. So that's really, it's probably more, it's definitely at the soft end of the spectrum, and it may even not be DDL at all. Okay, so it may provide greater benefits to learners than pedagogical materials or approaches that rely solely on autonomous data-driven learning. Right, so I'm not quite sure what solely is doing in there, because it seems to me that there is very little, very few materials or approaches that rely solely on autonomous data-driven learning. However, it does seem to be there that they are certainly not particularly supportive of data-driven learning. Okay, so I think what that shows then is this sort of climb really from the taken for granted, yeah, obviously this is the case, through this sort of rather cautious, rather hedged acceptance of Bell to this equally cautious rejection by Dolgova and Müller. So where are we? Well, that is the question. Bell says, and this is the same paper, but in a slightly different part of the paper, most EAP teachers will probably recognize the promotion of learner autonomy as an inherent pedagogical principle of EAP. So again, it's this doesn't need researching, it doesn't even need discussing. It is absolutely part of what it means to be involved in EAP. Chen and Flaju, however, writing a little earlier, are concerned that we still don't have enough autonomous use of corpora. And they say, you know, we've got to come up with ways of helping students to become more autonomous. Lastly, just moving on to Boulton and Vietkina. And I think this is something with which I would very much agree. Skills such as critical thinking, independent learning, and learner autonomy feature prominently in article conclusions. And that's the sort of the part where you state, oh, obviously, let's just take this for granted. It's the Shen et al. Attitude as alleged benefits of DDL, but we found virtually no direct exploration of these concepts as research objectives. So it seems to be taken for granted on the one hand, but actually not analysed, not examined, not researched on the other. And the other little quote I like is, while operationally defining these abstract constructs, it's certainly not straightforward. And I think that points at one of the problems, perhaps. It's been too difficult to do this. We hope that future innovative research will pursue this challenging yet most promising direction. Yes, so we're ending there with a hope. The development of learner autonomy is alleged, it's not proved, and it's not part of general research objectives. And with that, I would absolutely concur. So let's ask then, well, in that case, what is happening in autonomy in the DDL classroom, and particularly thinking about EAP? Before we sort of dive into that, I'd like to begin by noting Oleg's conditions for autonomy, because they have consequences. And although I'm not going to go into those consequences in detail today, they must be borne in mind. Okay, so learner autonomy does not stand alone. Okay, so Oleg says, learners must know how to make decisions. Autonomy is an ability which can be developed. Now, that, in fact, leaves open the possibilities for teachers to help in that development. They can offer students opportunities for autonomy, but at the same time, that implies that they have to give up some control. So in other words, if you're going to facilitate students' autonomy, that implies you yourself can't be fully in control as a teacher. The other thing that Oleg says is that learners must have the possibility of exercising autonomy. So you may have autonomy as an ability or a capacity, but if you don't exercise it, then you are not going to be doing autonomous language learning. And this has consequences, of course, for institutions. So institutions have to basically offer teachers opportunities for autonomy in order for autonomy to make its way into the classroom. And what that means is, of course, that institutions also have to give up some of their control. So, for example, if teachers have to adhere to a very rigid syllabus, then it's going to be extremely difficult, if not impossible, for them to introduce student autonomy in their classroom. Now, as I said, I'm not going to deal with, there won't be time to deal with teacher and institutional autonomy, but I think we have to bear those in mind, and that these three groups, students, teachers, and institutions, these three groups of actors, are interdependent. Okay, so they are very much interconnected, and there is a very delicate balance, I think, to be struck between those three groups of actors. Okay, so, but what about what actually happens in class? Well, in the traditional approach, of course, you've got the 3 Ps: presentation, practice, production, and you have teacher. You have the teacher as the locus of control in general. The DDL approach, then, one of the ways in which it's been formulated by Carter and McCarthy is as the 3 I's. And these then give us, first of all, illustration, so students looking at data, interaction, students discussing, sharing opinions and observations, and then induction, so students making their own rule for a particular feature. Flower Dew adds to that intervention. And what's interesting about adding that is that while the 3 I's approach seems to be firmly situated towards the hard end of that continuum, Flower Dew's intervention, the possibility of including intervention between interaction and induction, actually pulls it back towards the center part of guided induction of that climb. So if you like, when we're thinking about TDL in the classroom, then we are probably thinking along the lines of an approach which is similar to the 3 I's or the 4 I's, depending where one is on that spectrum. And of course, where you situate your teaching on that spectrum will depend very, very much upon your own context, your own students, and as a teacher, your own knowledge of how your students are going to take up benefit from DDL. So I'd like to move on a little then, and I'd like to think about how DDL fits into the context of autonomy in the classroom. And it's interesting here to look at the work of Renders, who has put forward 8 stages in the development of autonomy in class, so in classrooms. So I'm going to just go through these 8 stages and see how DDL fits or does not fit into those stages. How DDL research, I mean, yeah. So his first 3 stages are essentially very preparatory. So identifying needs, setting goals, planning, learning. And it seems to me that these 3 stages tend to be very teacher directed. Okay, they may be syllabus directed as well, of course, but channeled then through the teacher. It seems to me that there is little scope, that the research does not really show us students working with DDL very much in terms of identifying their needs, setting their goals, and planning their learning. It doesn't seem to have, it doesn't seem to really be to the fore in these early stages. I think it could be, okay. I think the responsibility could be shared much more widely between teachers and learners. So when we move on then to the next 2 stages, stages 4 and 5, I think DDL research has offered some scope for learner autonomy. And I think you can see that, for example, where classroom tasks have given students a choice of resources. So, for example, they may be choosing between using Corpus, Corpus-based, or accessing a Corpus, and not using Corpus-based materials. They may also, of course, be choosing between different corpora. Okay, but in some of the studies, we do see this the possibility for some autonomy in the selection of resources. And of course, that's also true when compiling do-it-yourself corpora, in the sense that it is the students who choose what they put in their corpus. And they can put papers in and take papers out at will. They can build more than one corpora. They can divide it up into subcorpora and so on. So again, they are not just selecting resources, but actually resources, sorry. Okay, so that not just selecting, but actually building, constructing their own resources. And I think that that is also an autonomous, an instance of autonomous, of student autonomy. When we move on to 6, this is where, which Reinders calls the practice stage. This is where really most DDL studies have concentrated their effort. And what we notice is that there have been a lot of experimental studies. Now, I think that this is absolutely, this was absolutely necessary, particularly in the earlier years of DDL. It was absolutely vital to establish that DDL could be effective. But at the same time, if you are setting up an experiment as a teacher researcher, then it is tightly controlled. And to the extent that it is tightly controlled, I think it offers much less scope for learner autonomy. Okay, and as soon as you allow learner's choice, then you have lost to a certain extent experimental control. Another big part of DDL research is on basically error correction. Now, here I think, again, there has been quite a lot of scope exercised for students to work autonomously. So, for example, Crossthwaite's study shows students identifying errors and formulating their own queries. And indeed, this is true. There's also a paper by, I think, Mull and Conrad, where students do the same, carry out the same sort of processes. So in practice, there is certainly scope for autonomous learning by students, autonomous practice by students. I think it could be increased. When we move on to Render's last 2 stages, these involve monitoring progress and assessment and revision. Monitoring progress, again, there doesn't seem to be very much here in terms of DDL, in terms of, sorry, I should make that absolutely clear, in terms of students monitoring their own progress in DDL. There is a lot of learner evaluation of DDL, which comes into assessment, and really a wide range of studies there. It's also very well worth mentioning Mizumoto et al.'s study, where they set up a psychometric scale to measure the perceived benefits and preferences in DDL. And I think that's an important step forward. There doesn't seem to me to be very much quantification of the extent of autonomy, how much autonomy was exercised. And in terms of revision, again, there doesn't seem to me to be very much evidence of learner input into revised courses. So learners are asked very often to evaluate the DDL course, but it isn't clear to me how that evaluation by students then leads into something which the students then can carry forward in terms of ongoing learning. Where courses have been modified, that has always taken place by, it seems to me, I shouldn't say always, but that has normally perhaps taken place by the teacher actually looking at the learners' evaluations and then maybe incorporating some of the students' ideas into revision. But it doesn't seem to be a very direct, again, it's teacher mediated very much. There isn't, I can't see much evidence for learner input, direct learner input into revised courses. So summing up then, what could we say? Well, at stages 1 to 3, I think there's little evidence of student autonomy so far. I'd be very happy to be proved wrong on any of these. But I think there is scope there for increased student autonomy. And I think the Geluso and Yamaguchi papers show you how that it can be done if there is the will to do it. Stages 4 to 6, then I think there's some evidence for student autonomy being incorporated into DDL as far as the research record goes. This is actually quite, it's quite limited in the sense that students are offered a degree of choice, but one doesn't get the sense that students are really taking control here very much. Okay, in other words, I think that you could DDL for autonomy could also be increased here. And again, stages 7 and 8, there seems to be very little evidence for this here, and I think it could be increased. It may well be that this emphasis on establishing the effectiveness of DDL has been, sorry, Mr. Word out there, has been at the expense of attention to student autonomy. So in a sense, what I'm saying is that the field has focused so much on establishing effectiveness that, I mean, you know, I'm agreeing with Boulton and Vyadkina that there has been a concomitant focus away from attention to some of these wider issues, one of which is indeed student autonomy. Okay, so I'd like to move on then, and I'd like to recall Benson's definition of autonomy as learning outside the classroom. And I'd like to introduce, I'm going to discuss this study of mine. It wasn't actually exactly in the way that I've been describing. It wasn't actually focused on autonomy. It was focused on student intentions and their realization or non-realization. However, I do think it's shed some light on what may be going on when students are working autonomously outside the DDL classroom. By the way, I'm absolutely not claiming that this is the innovative research that Boulton and Vyadkina have been calling for. Okay, so students' intentions to use Corpora autonomously. Well, yep, okay, good intentions are aplenty. And here are just some of the studies that ask the question, do you intend to use Corpus in the future? And you can see the percentages of the students are really very, very high. So, you know, Hevela, an early study, 88%, my study, 94%. Karpenko and Second, even better, at 100%. And then Jablonkai and Chevron at 78%. These are really, really high percentages of students who are enthused and who intend to use Corpora autonomously. There are a couple of warning flags, however, one of which is that the numbers are very small. Okay, so they range from 9 to 50. You know, that's really not very many students. And of course, the ultimate question is, can we rely on their intentions? And perhaps a little bit of introspection into our own intentions might suggest that the answer is no, we probably can't. I wanted to test that. My apologies if you think you've seen this slide before. The numbers are different. The context, of course, is the same. So yeah, you may have seen something similar. So the course that this is based on is called Writing in Your Field with Corpora. It's part of the academic writing program, 4 to 7 classes a year and 1 2-hour session a week for 6 weeks. I'm looking here at 182 students. So we now have really quite a large group. And about 70% doctoral, 20% masters. STEM is the largest disciplinary area, with social sciences and humanities also well represented, I would argue. 32 different L1s and an equal number of male and female students. So this is the group that I'm just going to examine. The approach of the course was that students built do-it-yourself corpora of research articles in their fields. And the aim of the course, again, sorry if you've seen this before, but it is the same course, was to explore disciplinary discourse functions in class. So we had that as our focus, but the other focus I had in setting up this course and in carrying on teaching it was the idea that this would give students a tailor-made corpus resource for autonomous use. My aim was always to, if you like, make myself redundant and get students to use corpora themselves outside class. Software, AntConc, and the Ant file converter, which we used for converting PDFs to plain text files. Okay, so 2 data sets. An immediate post-course questionnaire. How often do you use your corpus outside class? So that's right at the end, carried out right at the end of the course. I categorized as regular use everything from several times a day to about once a week. And that's primarily because, for example, PhD research students may very well only write about once a week. Occasional use then I categorize as about once a month or seldom. And then non-use is never. And then there was the option to say other, okay, and that's what I've characterized as variable use, but I haven't included those figures in what I'm going to show you today. The other question on the questionnaire that is going to be part of this discussion is multiple choice, where the issue was, I intend to use my corpus for help with my English in the future, and they could disagree, neither disagree or agree, and agree. Okay, and in fact, in the figures that I'm going to show you, I have aggregated strongly disagree and somewhat disagree, and I've aggregated somewhat agree and strongly agree. Okay, second set of data then, completed 1 year after the end of the corpus course. Have you used your own corpus at any time since the academic writing course ended? It was necessary to formulate the question in this way because I wanted to capture not just possibly PhD students who are still writing, still doing their academic course, and therefore would be candidates for still using the corpora. But in addition to them, I also wanted to find out about the master's students who might have used their corpus intensively while they were writing their dissertation, but since stopped, okay, because they were no longer doing academic work. And then, if yes, how often do or did you use it? And the same options as for the immediate post-course. 3 research questions then. I wanted to know the extent of autonomous corpus use immediately post-course. I wanted to know the intentions at that point in time as well. Okay, so this is also immediate post-course. Do you intend to carry on using your corpus? And I wanted to know the extent of autonomous corpus use after a year. So let's start with that first research question. Okay, and you can see this looks very nice indeed. I was very pleased. You've got over 60% regular users, 20-odd% occasional users, and under 10% of non-users. So this looks really, really nice. We've got high, regular, autonomous use of DDL. And at this point, one is saying to oneself, oh, well, in that case, the DDL course seems to have been very effective. We have got most people using Corpora autonomously outside the class. So what happens? Okay, what are their intentions like? So we know we've got them at the immediate course stage, immediate post-course stage, but you know, what about the future? How do they envisage the future? And again, this looks very good indeed. So you can see that you've got, in fact, the majority in each category, including the non-users, are agreeing that they will use their corpus in the future. Okay, so you've got the agree in gold, neither agree nor disagree is in grey, and then the brown is disagree. Looking at those figures then, what is obvious is that in each category of user, a large majority of students intend to use their corpus autonomously in the future. So the majority of each type of user is saying that. And in total, you've got 87% of all students intend to use their corpus autonomously in the future. So again, it's all looking very promising. It looks as though we might have made a real difference here in encouraging students to move on to using Corpora autonomously for their own purposes outside class. But let's have a look at research question 3, the extent of autonomous corpus use at delayed post-course. And suddenly the picture looks very, very different indeed. Okay, so now regular users have diminished, non-users have increased, occasional users have more or less stayed the same. So I just want to compare the 2 stages, because I think that makes the reductions in autonomous use really stand out. Okay, and what we can see is that the bottom bar then is the immediate post-course use, and that's as we saw up in the 60s, and then the regular use, we can see how much it's diminished in the top bar, and it's diminished down to in the 30s. Interestingly, occasional use doesn't seem to have changed. Okay, and that's something we'll look at a little bit more in a minute. And non-use, of course, has increased. So what we find then is that after a year, there is a very different picture, and by no means such an encouraging picture as the one we had earlier. So what can we say? Well, here are the figures. We can say there's been a large decrease in regular autonomous use. And of course, what this implies is that intentions do not match the reality. Okay, So something is going on there. Students are keen, they are committed, but something is going on that means that they actually, in the real world, don't do it. They don't operate autonomously with their corpora. So I wanted to ask another question, which was to break that down a little bit. We know that these are the figures for regular, occasional, and non-use, but they're aggregates. And I wanted to know how they break down by each category of user. Could we say, for example, that once a regular autonomous user, then you're going to stay a regular autonomous user? Okay, I slightly apologize for this rather complicated diagram. I've tried to make it as clear as I can by using colors, but I do recognize that it may take a bit of getting your heads around. Okay. In purple, basically we have no change, okay? So where you see regular users, it's that quantity that stay regular users at immediate, regular users at delayed. And the same goes for occasional users and for non-users. Where you see the strong pink, then that's the decrease to non-use, okay? And you can see that there are a substantial number of occasional users who decrease to non-use, and the substantial number of regular users who also decrease to non-use. For the regular users, we also have those who decrease to occasional use, and that's in the pale pink. Increases, we can see immediately, are far less prevalent. And you can see the bright yellow is increase to regular. That's what we would love to happen. And then the pale lemon color is the increase to occasional. So I think one of the things to notice is that there are a considerable number, in fact 43%, for whom there is no change, okay? So, you know, if they were an occasional user before, they're still an occasional user, and so on, okay? At the same time, it's also noticeable that occasional users tend to decrease to non-use, okay? And I think that's one place where attention could be given. The picture for regular users is slightly different. So you've got 50% of the regular users staying regular users, and then you're more or less equally divided between those who decrease to occasional use and those who decrease to non-use. Okay, and there again, there is, I think, potential for people, there is potential for us to work with those figures to improve autonomous use. So let's take a look at these changes then. As I've said, 50% of regular users remain regular users, and that's very good. That's very interesting and encouraging. 50% of non-users remain non-users, so that's rather disappointing. These are people that we haven't convinced, who haven't found it useful, and you know, basically they've probably quit using Corpora completely. It doesn't mean, of course, that they will never come back to Corpora, and I think that's a different issue. What does concern me is the 25% of regular users who become non-users, and that's where I think one could make a difference, because then the question arises of why, when they presumably found it useful to be regular users at the immediate post-course stage, what causes them then to shift right the way down to become non-users. 50% of occasional users also become non-users. And there again, I think that's where proponents of DDL have some work to do to convince occasional users to up their game and become regular users rather than to become non-users. Okay, so that's another area, I think, where interventions might be able to help. So I'm going to move on to the last part now and ask, okay, so what can be done? What future directions are there? And I'm going to make some pedagogical suggestions and then some suggested research directions. Pedagogically, the first thing I would like to see is that learners is help for learners to turn their intentions into reality. Okay, because if you say that you intend to do something, then you do have that as a sort of as a goal, if you like. But at the same time, it seems to me that probably it may be unrealistic in certain cases. And I think that helping students by discussing realistic goals for autonomous DDL use could aid this. It seems to me that when we talk about training for DDL, we are mostly focusing on the technology. Okay, how do you access concordances? What's in a corpus? And how do you interpret the concordance lines, for example? But less seems to me to be done concerning when DDL use would be useful, when it wouldn't, and what we might decide together with students and where DDL could fit into their own learning practices. So I think that discussing these things with students would help. The other thing that I think is very often missing from work on DDL is the sense of getting students to reflect on their DDL use. And I think that also could be very useful for them in promoting autonomy and in letting them decide when DDL use was going to be useful to them and when it frankly wasn't. And interestingly, of course, as soon as you give students a questionnaire, you do in fact promote reflection. But in a sense, certainly in my work, I haven't then incorporated that into class materials, which would help students to take their autonomous DDL use further. And then the last thing I put here is encouraging students to monitor and assess their DDL use. Now, I think this is a big ask, actually, because certainly in my experience, postgrad students are extremely busy people. And if you're going to then ask them to monitor and assess their DDL use, I'm wondering how much it's going to happen. So this is something that it would be very useful for them to do. And perhaps it's something that needs to be set up first in the classroom, which would make it easier for them to carry it on afterwards. The other thing that I was focused on was helping occasional autonomous users to become regular autonomous users. This is also a little bit tricky in the sense that one of the reasons for desisting with corpus use is, I think, is lack of time. Okay, and what lack of time means is that the student who is faced with the deadline of writing their paper is thinking, you know, how do I find out this information? And they are probably going straight to Google because they're so familiar with it and it's so easy. Nothing wrong with that, except that certainly for PhD students, a DIY corpus is going to give them more targeted help. But they're probably looking at that as an option, maybe not even looking at it as an option and saying, no, that's going to be too time consuming. And the more students look at corpus use and see it as time consuming, the less they do it. And the less they do it, the more inefficient and time consuming it becomes. So you get into this negative spiral where lack of practice means inefficiencies and difficulties, and then that means abandonment of corpus use. One of the ways of getting around that, I think, is to try and make student corpus practice in class so routine, so inbuilt that a corpus becomes the tool of first resort, not the tool of last resort, which I think it sometimes is. So that's what lies behind increasing the amount of student corpus practice in class, to try and then establish a virtuous circle. And then I think relating in-class practice closely to autonomous use. So actually drawing very specific relations between what they do in class and what they need to do for their own writing practices outside class. And I tried to do this a little in a paper on editing with Corpora, in the sense that I tried to get students to transfer directly their corpus practice in class to what they were doing with their own writing. And of course, and this is something which many people have stressed, none of this would or will happen without engaging with teachers. So unless you have autonomy aware teachers and DDL aware teachers, you are not going to get autonomy and DDL aware students. Okay, how about some research directions then? Well, I think we definitely need more research on how to develop student autonomy through DDL. I think they make a very good marriage, but somehow they haven't got it together, or at least I see little evidence of that. So how can we best help students to identify their needs, set their goals, plan DDL learning? How does that work in a DDL class? Can it work in a DDL class? And of course, also monitoring progress. Interesting, I think, here is the potential role of local learner corpora. So either class corpora, so corpora of the writing in class, or indeed corpora of the student's own writing. And I think it would be very interesting. Kotos has, I think, 2014 paper where she shows that having a learner corpus as well as a larger, I think, online corpus she used, actually is much more motivating than just using a non-learner corpus, an expert corpus. So I think that's one area which it would be very interesting to research. Finally, then, some questions to which I do not have answers. Okay, so I think we need some more research on assessing the extent and effects of autonomy. How do we quantify in-class autonomy? How to assess the effects of autonomy? And does greater autonomy lead to proficiency gains, which is perhaps a very important question in DDL, so autonomy in DDL. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. Thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions. Shall I stop sharing now?
Thanks, Maggie. We've got this, and just about to get on here with a brief look at, when I eventually find it, I put it in the wrong place, our speaker that is coming up. But for now, let's very quickly thank our speaker today, Dr. Maggie Charles, for a really interesting talk on an issue that is a perennial problem with studies on data-driven learning and corpus-based language learning and teaching, particularly the drop in continued use is something that is seen in a number of studies, including my own personal experience. And it's great to get some insight onto why that might be happening and what we can do to resolve it. I've got time. I know that Maggie, you've managed to champion through that with that sore throat there, so much appreciated there. Questions brief. Lawrence had his hand raised. Would you like to ask your question directly, Lawrence?
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Well, I was going to write it, but it would be quite a long thing to write.
Oh, so that's fine.
My comment. I had a comment and then a question following it. So, I've argued for a long time that corpus tools tend to hide the salient patterns in writing, for example, in the DDL classroom. So the standard corpus tool, the quick concordancer, will show you the results in alphabetical order. And the only way to find a salient pattern is to scroll through hundreds, maybe thousands of lines of alphabetically ordered patterns and try to find something salient in there. So in that sense, the traditional corpus tool has not been suitable for autonomous learning. It requires the teacher to be in the room to say, scroll down to line 755 and then look at the pattern there and what do you think? So the question is, do you, that is my feeling, but do you see that as one of the main problems with DDL? And following the question would be, if you have tried the new version of Ankong, which has the quick pattern feature, do you think that would change things in any way?
Yeah, thanks for your question, Lawrence. It's really interesting. I would slightly take issue with your statement that the teacher has to be in the room to tell students to scroll down. Although I am very conscious that when I actually surveyed students and asked them whether they used the sort bit of the tool, I was utterly amazed and horrified at the number who didn't. Okay, and if you're not going to use the sort function, then essentially, you are scrolling down dozens, hundreds of lines. However, that is a question of corpus practice and corpus experience. Okay, and that is something that I find. So although there seems to be a recalcitrant minority who refuse to sort under all circumstances, I think they think it's too slow. Most students, I think, okay, this is anecdotally, can't give you evidence for that, I think do eventually realize that they not only need to get it up on the screen, they also need to sort it in order to see those banks of patterns. I have to confess, I started to use your new version of Ankong, but actually I'm going to confess that I found it slightly more difficult to upload my own Corpora. Okay, so I haven't got to grips with it. So I really can't answer that question. What I would say, I think, is that it is likely that some students, some users, more broadly, prefer one way and some users will prefer another way. So to have that choice, I think, is brilliant. It's excellent. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
I can 100% vouch for the new version in terms of getting that information straight to the top of the list. It's just an absolute game changer. I was big upping the new version in a chat I had recorded on Monday with a guy at the university in Chile. That I think that will come out as a podcast soon. So I'll share that with you, with everybody in the audience, and Maggie and Lawrence yourselves. So yeah, can definitely recommend that as a new way of getting to the meat of the corpus in a much simpler and faster, effective way. So let's go into the questions now that I've received from the chat. Got a question here from Mustafa, who asks, regarding EAP for postgrads, is it important to have an element of DIY corpus compilation on the syllabus? Or should learners be about this?
Sorry, you broke up at the end there. Or should
learners be allowed to make their own choices?
Yeah, thank you for the question. In my experience, learners, at least where I was teaching in Oxford in that time span, were really the vast majority of them not aware of Corpora, and so really would find it very difficult to make that decision. Certainly, very often at the very beginning of corpus use, I think the teacher or the instructor needs to do a really big selling job on it. Okay, and by that I mean in showing the students how it can relate to their work, how it can help them personally. So basically getting their input into the tasks that you're doing. But should it be on the syllabus? Yeah, what I would argue now is that I think it would be very good for it to be on the syllabus, particularly for PhD students, because their work is so individualized, it's so niche, that if you just look on Google, which is their tool of first resort very often, you are simply not going to find, you're not going to find the information that you individually need. Yeah. For master's students, I am now a little less certain. Okay. And my reason for that really is that their subjects tend not to be quite so specialized, and they also tend not to need the corpus for an ongoing 2, 3, 4 years. Okay, so that then I think one has to weigh up very, very carefully the time taken to build the corpus as against the benefit that they're going to get from it. Okay, and I have actually, yeah, I think that would be a question of looking at your own students, and I would be less confident about saying that should be incorporated in the syllabus, unless they are language and linguistics students, of course, in which case definitely as simply another tool.
Thanks, Maggie. Okay, of course, we do have tools, as well as Lawrence also has a tool that will develop, a self-compiled corpus based on just some keywords that are used. So maybe if a master's student could compile such a corpus within a few minutes or a few seconds, then they don't have to take the time to explicitly curate, lots of different papers into a purpose-built corpus. So the technology is there to speed things up.
Yes. Yeah, I think you have to be very careful using the tool, that you are getting into your corpus what you think you're getting into the corpus.
Yes,
okay. And what I've found sometimes is that in certain areas, some of the papers just aren't actually in the area into which they are categorized.
Yeah.
So a certain amount of corpus experience, again, is necessary, even if you're going to use that tool, which admittedly, is very quick, very handy to have. But it does need, it needs a sort of an experienced eye on it, just to make sure that it would not be leading students in completely the wrong direction.
Received a couple of questions from people who were asking about whether the participants in your study that you presented in the second half were asked to explain why they stopped using the corpus data. Did you have the opportunity, even anecdotally, to reach out to them?
Yeah, I do have some numbers on that. So as far as I recollect, about 29% of them were just not doing any writing.
Okay.
So, so in a sense, one ought to go back to those students and pursue them down the years, asking them, are you using your corpus now? Which, of course, I haven't actually done. Then there was about 20% were using other tools, of which, of course, the most frequently used was Google. And then there were two at 10%, one of which was time issues, which I dealt with fairly briefly, but I think that that's actually a more important issue than is reflected in the 10%, because obviously if you're using another tool, and if that tool is Google, probably, and indeed quite a lot of the respondents said this, your reason for choosing Google is that it's faster and and it's good enough, which is also an interesting point. And then, okay, so 10% on that time, 10% had problems with their corpus, and those issues fell into the corpus isn't big enough. So one is inclined to say, well, you built it, you need to make it bigger. And interestingly, several students actually said that they wished they had built it up more during the class periods. Okay. And then there were 5% who didn't need it because they had a supervisor or a friend who basically worked on their English with them.
Okay.
That was about, and then there were various people. There were interesting things about people who were researching other languages and just found it too difficult to get the French out of their corpus. And another interesting strand was, which I'm going to try and follow up later, is different disciplines. So there were saying, well, this is useful, but I don't think I need it in my discipline. Yeah. Okay, maths springs to mind there as one of the areas where the student just felt, well, it's I don't need a corpus. I think they said their maths writing was very plain and simple.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, there's not much you can do about that.
Sorry, you've broken up again.
No, I said there wasn't much you could do about the maths people, I'm afraid.
No. Well, it would be interesting to see. That was one maths person, but other maths people, it'd be interesting to compare.
Great.
I mean, and to see to try and validate that argument or not.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead then and ask just one more question, given the time that we have. And I guess the question is from Olfa, and the question is, if we consider decline of autonomy in terms of thinking about DDL and computer-assisted language learning in general, can we think of maybe beginning with more deductive tasks that are teacher-led before then slowly leading to that inductive approach that is purported to be the autonomous stage of DDL use? So what do you think about that?
Yes, I think that seems to me to be a sensible way in. One has to, of course, begin with where the students are, and the students would not be used to. You would be introducing probably far too much that was new. If you're introducing the corpus, you're introducing the methodology, and then you're asking students to do it on their own. Okay, I think it needs preparation, and some of that preparation is indeed starting at the softer end. Okay, also maybe starting with paper concordances is another way in which you can start that. But I think what I'm more concerned with really is that there is a way of that what we're trying to do is to encourage not just corpus literacy, but awareness of autonomy and moving not just towards becoming proficient corpus users or reasonably proficient corpus users, but also moving towards becoming more autonomous in corpus use, because I think that is necessary, and especially at postgraduate level.
Well, I think that draws us to a close for today. Again, I'd like to thank our speaker, Dr. Maggie Charles, and I'm sure that we've had a ton of wonderful messages coming through in the chat, and I'm sure everybody is clapping in, however you do this in Zoom land. But yeah, thanks so much. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you on board and listen to your talk today. Just a quick promotion then for next week. My old Cambridge University study buddy, Dr. Akira Murakami, is going to present insights from Learner Corpora looking at second language development and use of English grammatical morphemes. So stay tuned for that. But again, sincere thanks to Maggie, and I hope that your throat gets better soon and you can enjoy the upcoming weekend.
Okay, and before I go, I'd just like to thank you very much indeed for inviting me, and it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you and to answer your questions.
Thanks,
so thank
Maggie.
you very much.
It's been great to have you on, and we wish you all the best. So we're going to stop the recording here, everyone, and we'll see you same time, not same day. We are on Thursday next time, so do note the day change, but the time will be the same for those of you who are tuning in from around the world. We did break over 200 participants in the end, so another wonderful milestone, another achievement reached, and we hope we can crack 200 again next week for our friend Akira. But bye for now, everybody. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you all next week.
Right.